There's not much I can say about the Mega Man X series as a whole that hasn't already been said before. While it contains some of the best games in the franchise, it's also not a very consistent series and has a couple of stinkers. However, even some of the series' darkest hours have at least one spark of life in them, that being, you guessed it, the music. More often than not, I absolutely adore the tunes that play during these games, and they do a lot to elevate the game experience, whether the rest of that experience is great or awful. In this video, I've decided to take all the mainline Mega Man X games soundtracks and see how good they are compared to each other. I've got quite a bit I'd like to say about the soundtracks of the Mega Man X games since I've listened to them many times in the past couple years, and since the quality of the music is completely independent of the quality of the games they're attached to, there's a chance you'll be surprised by how I believe they stack up against one another. My goal is to rank these against each other based on how good the music sounds and how well they suit the events of the games they're attached to, so without further ado, it's ranking time. I feel really bad about ranking this soundtrack so low because I like the game it's attached to quite a bit, but I suppose it would be wrong to make a biased list, so here goes. Mega Man X2 has, in my opinion, the weakest mainline MMX soundtrack. I should make it clear that I don't think any of these soundtracks are bad, but compared to some of the powerhouses later in the series, yeah, X2's music doesn't really impress me. For starters, they overhauled the sound font from X1, having a similar instrument set but replacing the samples, but this didn't benefit the soundscape in any meaningful way. The guitars sound whinier than before, the drums don't sound nearly as punchy as they should, and it doesn't have quite the same cohesive sound as X1's music. But that's not the only problem I have with X2's soundtrack. For one thing, the loops are generally pretty short, which is especially felt in the non-level tracks like the passwords, stage select, and boss themes. It honestly feels like they just gave up on those, figuring, the players only spend 5 seconds choosing their Maverick anyway, whereas most other X games would put more effort into those tracks. Even most of the level tracks just aren't the greatest listen to me. Tracks like Wire Sponge and Morph Moth's theme tend to feel a bit too empty, with not much in the way of interesting bass lines or counter melodies. Even when the tracks try to have more energy, it can come off as overly frantic, which generally isn't my thing. Wheelgator's theme sounds more like a boss track than a level track, and what is even the deal with Magnus Centipede's theme? This is supposed to be some kind of tactical espionage mission, but the drummer sounds like he's going in guns blazing. That said, there are some tunes here and there that stand out. I think X2's level tracks are at their best when they try to be more laid back. The themes for Bubble Crab and Crystal Snail are among my favorites, both starting off with a soft vibraphone piece before naturally transitioning into something more intense. Also, while the ending and Castrol themes aren't as good as X1's, they nonetheless end the game on a good note musically. This game's soundtrack has its moments, but I don't find myself coming back to it much at all. Next up is Mega Man X8. A lot of people love this one, but I can't really see it as much more than okay. Oh wait, we're talking about the music, not the game. To be honest, I was originally considering putting this below X2, but upon further reflection, I think X8's music is just a little better since it overall isn't dragged down by the same technical issues in terms of loop length and an incohesive soundscape, even if those things are just a natural result of more advanced hardware. With that said, I'm still not enthusiastic about most of it. This game places a lot of emphasis on a certain hard rock sound, which isn't necessarily a condemnation on its own, as you'll see later on the list. However, in this case, the guitar sample they use gets kind of repetitive, and little of it is riveting stuff as far as composition goes. The theme used in Noah's Park is probably the least engaging opening stage theme in the series, and it rarely gets any better from there. There's a leitmotif they use for the title screen, Maverick bosses, stage clear, result screen, and credits, but it ends up becoming stale pretty quickly since they don't rework it enough. I think this is a byproduct of the game's rock emphasis. The best you're gonna get is the boss theme being a bit faster and in a different key, which, yay? While it's neat that several levels have more than one track, the tunes for Booster Forest, Inferno, Metal Valley, and Central White sound really generic and samey, with not much to set them apart instrumentation-wise. And I'm never really bopping my head while I'm listening to them when I really feel like I should be. They try to go for something more ambient and pitch black, but while I can normally enjoy some good ambience, this doesn't really do anything for me, it's just some long, quiet guitar notes. Frankly, these issues are only made more apparent by how great Jacob is. Yes, it's another rock track, but it starts out way more head bopping than anything else I've listed, and apropos for the level it's attached to, only elevates itself higher as it goes on. Whenever I listen to it, I can only think to myself, why can't the rest of this game's music be this good? Granted, there are some other standout tracks in this game that I'd be remiss not to mention. Primrose has a unique instrumentation and a powerful composition, and the harmonies do well to underscore how all over the place the stage is. Gateway manages a blend of haunting and calming that perfectly suits the boss rush room, and the Vile Boss theme is another rock track with sufficient energy to it. I think these highs are higher than anything in X2, but once again, they make me wish I enjoyed the rest of the soundtrack just as much. As much as I hate Mega Man X7, I honestly can't be too harsh on its music. I should clarify that as far as this list is concerned, there's actually a pretty sizable gap between this game and X8. For some positives, I think the soundscape is more sophisticated than the previous games in the series, befitting the leap to 6th generation hardware. The drum samples sound more varied and unconventional, and there are little sounds sprinkled throughout the tracks to give them more depth, like the guitar harmonics in the tunnel bass theme, or the kind of sweeping noises in tracks like the Palace Road theme just before Red. In general, it feels like this music has more layers than the typical Mega Man X soundtrack. Sadly for me, this is a case where the compositions are 50-50 between excellent and just kind of okay. Starting with the menus and similar themes, I think the game's options theme is underrated, and the second stage select theme sounds fittingly climactic. However, the regular stage select theme isn't as good as it is for a lot of other games in this series, and weirdly, this is the only game without a Dr. Light capsule theme. I adore certain level tracks like the ones for the intro stage, tunnel bass, and radio tower, but none of the others quite reach those heights. Battleship, Cyberfield, the Crimson Palace Infiltration, etc. I like some of them, don't get me wrong, but many don't do too much to hook me in, even if the music generally does a perfectly fine job fitting the stages. There's also seemingly more cutscene music than previous games, which I appreciate, but it's about as hit or miss. Most notably, Cygnus' theme plays a lot in the cutscene following the intro stage, and much like the cutscene itself, it just drones on and on. The theme Revealing, meanwhile, is pretty nice, and I think it's funny how much of a gangsta-sounding theme Sigma has in the cutscenes. Even the composers can't take him seriously at this point. Although speaking of Sigma, the boss themes are generally pretty sick, and I love how the same melody is used for both Sigma phases, yet they sound distinct from each other. That's the kind of reworking of motifs that X8 needed more of. I'm glad that the music rarely sounds bad, as opposed to the gameplay, which is thoroughly bad, but it's not as universally great as many of the games higher on the list. Despite how much it latches onto the stylings of the previous couple games in the series, I think the music of Mega Man X3 on the Super Nintendo manages to stand on its own well enough. In theory, it has the same problems as X2's music, short loop points, a rather weak sound font, etc. The sound font issue might be even worse, since almost every track emphasizes the same guitar instruments, running the gamut of too much rock emphasis like X8. In practice, though, I think X3's soundtrack surpasses X2's and X8's by a good margin. One thing that helps is that this game uses much deeper sounding snare drums than X2 does, making the beat of each track easier to really latch onto. However, what really makes this such a good soundtrack for me is the compositions. Take Tunnel Rhino for example. At any given point, you can hear a lead guitar, a moving brass counter melody, and a bass line all working together in harmony, compared to something like Morph Moth or Wire Sponge, which only do this on and off. X3's music sounds a lot, richer, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. In general, these tunes are more frequently catchy than the soundtracks below this one are. Out of the whole X series, this game probably has the best theme song for Zero despite its short length. The long notes of Gravity Beetle's theme suit the Sunset Air Force setting, and tracks like Volt Catfish and Toxic Seahorse remind me of the stuff you'd often hear in X1. Both the opening stage theme and Doppler Stage 1 hit that sweet spot of sounding energetic and memorable, but not overly cluttered, but in different ways. The former sounding like there's an invasion you need to fight back against, and the latter making it sound like you're leading your own invasion. These are the kind of hummable jams I wish X8 had more of. While the stage select and especially the boss themes are still criminally short as I've said, at least they're not as messy sounding as their X2 equivalents. I can't say the same for the Dr. Light theme, which sticks out like a sore thumb and I think was genuinely broken at some point during development. Other than that, I think X3's music had an overall good showing. Actually, scratch that, it had two good showings. Okay, hear me out on this one. I was originally not sure whether or not this should be below the SNES version or possibly even X7, but after listening to these soundtracks a sufficient amount, this is the conclusion I came to. While the PlayStation version of Mega Man X3's soundtrack has some weak spots, I think it's the slightly better version taking the whole picture into account. It's also a little hard to talk about the music of Mega Man X3 on the PlayStation without first talking about the SNES version since they share the same compositions, so I figured, why bother? On paper, the idea of combining X3's compositions with CD quality instrumentation should be an unambiguous match made in heaven based on how the sound font was one of the SNES version's biggest limitations, and there are plenty of tracks that fulfill that promise. Blizzard Buffalo, or I guess Billzard Buffalo, is the best example, as the atmosphere that track was trying to evoke on SNES just comes through better on PS1. Most other tracks in the SNES version emphasize the guitar, but the PS1 version uses various synth instruments in their place. With some exceptions I'll get to, I don't believe anything about the compositions is lost with this change. Tracks like Toxic Seahorse and Gravity Beetle are just as great to listen to here as they were before. Blast Hornet's stage theme has a fuller sound and a less taserish lead instrument, which I consider welcome changes, and Neon Tiger is sped up a good amount, which I honestly think is more fitting for a jungle stage. However, the bouncier feel might not work for everyone, especially considering how dark and gritty the game's visuals are, and some tracks straight up did not survive the transition. The opening stage and Doppler Stage 1 are both supposed to be energetic scenarios, yet that energy no longer comes through in the PlayStation renditions of these pieces. These two soundtracks may trade some blows, but for me, the PS1 music is just a hair more enjoyable to listen to. In the past, I've succinctly called Mega Man X4's music pleasant on the ears, and that's still how I'd describe it. Not counting X3 on PS1, this was the first X game that got a completely CD quality soundtrack with the sound font limitations finally being lifted, and the results are a lot less gritty sounding than what we got on the Super Nintendo. With a few exceptions, the instrumentation and composition are very gentle compared to the rest of the series' music, making it easy to listen to and slotting in with the game's overall brighter exterior compared to the SNES trilogy. They are also simply able to do more with the soundscape than they could before. Flourishes like the intense note bending at the beginning of Cyber Peacock and the wind noises you hear throughout Frost Walrus are things you don't see in the previous X games, and while the game has a very unified style, the instrument set appears to change a bit more from piece to piece than past installments. Also, it's a clever touch how they mold X's and Zero's opening stage themes into their own unique stage clear themes, which X5 would also go on to do. I have mostly nice things to say about this game's music, making it a little hard to articulate why it's not higher on the list. I think it's simply because there's not as much oomph to the music as the ones above this. Partly because of the instrumentation, but also partly because of the composition. Don't get me wrong, there are some really bumpin' melodies in there, such as X's intro stage theme and Storm Owl's theme, but I can't say that applies to every track. With that said, I still enjoy a majority of these tunes, even when they're not the catchiest, because they're tonally spot on, from the playful jungle drums and pan flutes accompanying you as you bounce your way through web spider's foliage, to the simmering backdrop of Magma Dragoon managing to manifest itself in the music, to the tension you can feel in the spaceport and final weapons stages, to the somber emotions seeping through the flute and piano sounds as Zero battles Iris. These are powerful in their own way, and it's why I'd rank this soundtrack higher than something like X7's, which also had some not so catchy tracks but didn't really have enough spirit to make up for that. One other note, Frost Walrus's stage actually has two music pieces, one for each section, but it was the only stage to get this treatment despite every other stage also having two sections. It feels like a missed opportunity. Overall, a pretty great soundtrack, but not quite the best the series has to offer, even if the game itself is. The first Mega Man X game came out swinging in many ways, including having one of the most iconic soundtracks to grace a Super Nintendo game. And yeah, if any SNES Mega Man OST deserved that title, this is it, unless Mega Man Soccer changes my mind. To start, I consider it the most consistent soundtrack on this list. From beginning to end, the music is an absolute jam, without anything I can think of as being particularly weak. Even the little things are uniformly well made. The password theme offers the kind of relaxation you need after beating a challenging stage, and even the cutscene music was so good that future games had to find ways to integrate it. When it comes to the bulk of the soundtrack, the high-grade synth rock compositions somehow serve as the perfect next step from the previous generation's chiptunes. Every time I listen to the groovy bass and orchestra hits of Launch Octopus, the rolling toms of Spark Mandrill, the, well, fire melodies of Flame Mammoth, etc., I'm sitting there bouncing along in my seat. It's supremely catchy stuff. While the sound font and instrumentation isn't necessarily the best the system has to offer, it still sounds more cohesive and much better mixed than the other two SNES Mega Man X games. I mean, what other game has such heated boss music led by a vibraphone? The only reason it's not higher on the list is because the rock-infused sound is pretty homogeneous compared to the ones higher on the list, and the connection between the music and the on-screen action isn't the strongest. Now, this doesn't apply to every track. Chill Penguin's theme sounds appropriately, well, chill for a snow theme. Boomer Kawanger's slightly slower theme is the only track I can imagine fitting a long tower climb, and the Sigma stage themes perfectly transition from climactic to creepy as you get deeper into the fortress. For some of the others though, they probably could have gotten away with shuffling the level themes around without it sounding too unfitting. In fact, let's actually try that. Yep, it sure is Mega Man X. Ultimately, those are very minor blemishes on what is otherwise auditory excellence. While I'm here, I should probably make a quick detour for Maverick Hunter X. I don't think about its soundtrack as much as the others on this list, and it's not really mainline, but it is close and the only MMX spin-off I've played. Ideally, the move away from SNES sound hardware should benefit the music, and there are cases where it does, such as the castle stage themes, but in execution, certain tracks came out inferior. The move to a dance style, while not unfitting for a Mega Man X game, places less focus on the excellent melodies of the original tracks and makes the soundscape come off a bit muddied, and the guitar harmonics are excessive and slightly obnoxious. I'm not sure where I'd put it on the list, but my current guess is between X7 and X3. Mega Man X6's music is absolutely stellar and undoubtedly the most well-made aspect of the whole game. Frankly, I feel sorry that it couldn't use all of it in the old video, but there's only so much you can cram into 22 minutes, and sharing with Mega Man and Bass's soundtrack no less. As soon as you get to Control X, it's clear that X6's music went much further than most X soundtracks to suit what's going on in its stages. Most other opening stages are upbeat to grab your attention alongside the high-octane action, but X6's opening stage theme is instead poignant and slow, which is gripping in its own way and suits the tone after the apocalyptic events of X5. While the levels themselves degrade in quality after this, the tunes that play manage to maintain this high caliber. Many of the melodies are just as fun to hum as X1's, but the diversity of musical stylings is cranked higher than most X soundtracks. Shield Sheldon's stage has a really nice bass line and sounds mystical and low-key, which fits very well with the puzzle-esque nature of this stage. Blizzard Wolfang's music manages to sound subdued, despite using normally intense guitar and synth brass, which is honestly genius for an ice cave level filled with deadly traps. Infinity Majinion's Final Countdown is the perfect thing to listen to during a level about taking down an impossibly huge Reploid. You get the idea. There are plenty of other little touches I love. The funk guitar noises in the boss theme are something I would never expect in a Mega Man boss theme, even though they fit wonderfully. And in Rainy Turtloid's theme, there's a droning guitar noise in the background emulating the sound of rain falling. Now, while the direction for this soundtrack is overall fantastic, it's still not perfectly executed. Ground Scarefish's theme is the most glaring weak spot, with an overly simplistic melody and sort of annoying instrumentation. Also, maybe this is just me, but I feel like some of these tracks work solely because of how unbalanced the actual gameplay is. The over-the-top intensity of tracks like Blaze Heatnik's, Gates Lab, and Gates Battle theme would feel a little out of place if they didn't perfectly accompany the feelings of rage a first-time player might feel when playing through these sections. Well, ironically or not, Mega Man X6's music is nothing short of a delight to come back to time and time again. Can it get any better than this? Yes it can. Mega Man X5 soundtrack is as close to perfection as Mega Man X music has gotten, and it's possibly my most listened to game soundtrack of all time. And no, it's not just because of X vs. Zero, as masterful of a track as that is. The whole soundtrack completely excels for me. Well, almost the whole soundtrack. I'm not the biggest fan of the Rang Da Bang Da remix, and I would have preferred the Beta Duff McWhalen theme over the Final Game's Bubble Crab remix. I wouldn't call them bad, but there's a reason I said X1 had a more consistent soundtrack. The good news is that everything else about this soundtrack blows X1's out of the water. The intro stage themes for both X and Zero are the most upbeat and cheery sounding intro stage themes in the whole series, but after defeating the intro stage boss, the tone whiplashes into something more cataclysmal. The first stage select menu music ascends in a way that sounds like you're running out of time and should pick a stage as soon as possible. Grizzly Slash is the first stage the game points you to, and the track that plays sounds more dire and intense than most Mega Man X music. The largely rock-based themes for Izzy Glow and the Skyver both have these bridges where the lead instrument suddenly turns to an ominous synth, as if to say, hey, the world is in danger, louder than the actual stages could. Even the boss theme has choir sounds and a tinge of tragedy while still pumping up the player as much as any Mega Man boss theme. It's impossible for me to mentally separate these tracks from the events of these stages. When I hear the Matrix's theme and its flying air effects and heavy, almost forged sounding beat, I can only imagine a fiery domain managed by a big dinosaur. And come on, the crescendo and instant drop at the start of Squidward's stage fit the Ride Chaser segment like a glove. Wouldn't you agree? Yet even when separated from the events of the game, I simply find the compositions and instrumentations to beat out the rest of the series. After the light synth tunes of X4, X5 goes for a terrific blend of the stylings of X1, X3, and X4, while also forging a musical identity of its own. Dark Dizzy's stage has a beautiful yet haunting atmosphere to it that something like Frost Walrus or Pitch Black could only dream of, and the piece that plays for Axel the Red has a very standout melody greater than that of other jungle levels in the series. Being meant as the climax of the series, the music, at least the original stuff, gets more powerful as you near the climax of the game. Yes, it gets even better. Zero Stage 1 has a slow piano and chorus piece unlike any other final level in the series, making it sound like we've reached the apogee that this was intended to be, but when the true foe reveals himself, the music kicks into a rave-like piece that gives you one final push. The fan favorite, of course, is X vs. Zero, which was such a standout track in the series that it managed to get into Smash Bros. Remember how melancholic the Iris battle theme was in X4? Well, this track cranks it up to 11 while imbuing it with classic MMX synth rock instruments, and for a long foreshadowed battle between two formidable brothers in arms, it is simply perfect. But it doesn't stop there. The Sigma battle themes sound like a heightened version of what X1's final boss themes were going for. The cutscene music for when Zero is dying manages to take one of the most upbeat intro stage themes in the series and turn it into something absolutely heart-wrenching. And the credits theme is equally solemn, making it feel like this time for real, those who sacrifice themselves for the victory will never return. I don't care if I sound like a complete fool right now, the music of Mega Man X5 is a tour de force as far as Mega Man, nay, video game music is concerned. In spite of any issues I may have, no other soundtrack in this series has such a phenomenal blend of diversity, memorability, suitability, tension, energy, and pathos as the music of Mega Man X5. And there we have it, my ranking of the Mega Man X soundtracks. Let me know in the comments how you'd rank these soundtracks because there are 362,879 other ways to order them, so it's unlikely you agreed with everything I said. Maybe at some point I'll do this for the classic games, but that remains to be seen. For now, thanks for coming by fellas, and have a wonderful day.